Some people can spend an hour around a toxic person and walk away irritated. But an empath walks away altered. Not because they are weak. Not because they are overly dramatic. But because they do not just hear words, they register tension. They do not just notice behavior, they absorb atmosphere. They do not simply react to what is said. They pick up what is suppressed, what is shifting, what is about to explode, and what everyone else in the room is pretending not to feel. That is why toxic people drain empaths faster than they drain almost anyone else. Because for the empath, the interaction starts before the conversation starts. The body is already scanning. The mind is already adjusting. The nervous system is already making room for another person's instability. And by the time the empath realizes they are tired, they are not just tired. They are emotionally overextended from carrying signals that were never theirs to carry. Carl Jung understood something most people never see. The deepest forms of exhaustion are often invisible. They happen when a person is forced into constant contact with what has not been made conscious. And if you have ever felt completely depleted after being around someone who seemed to need, pull, provoke, or unsettle without end, then subscribe now. Because this channel is for people who have felt too much for too long, and are finally ready to understand why. It usually does not happen in one dramatic moment. That is what makes it so hard for an empath to explain. You leave a conversation and feel strangely heavy. Your body feels tight. Your mind feels full. You are not just tired in the normal sense. You feel as if something has been pulling on you the entire time, even if the other person never raised their voice, never openly attacked you, never gave you a clear reason to say, "This is why I feel so drained." That is one of the first signs of the pattern. Toxic people do not always exhaust empaths through obvious conflict. Very often, they do it through emotional inconsistency. A shift in tone. A look that makes you second-guess yourself. A silence that feels loaded. A subtle change in energy that makes you start scanning for what went wrong. And while other people might brush past that and stay centered, the empath does not. The empath starts reading. They read the face. The pauses. The emotional temperature. The hidden irritation. The disappointment that was never spoken directly. The need beneath the words. The instability behind the smile. And this happens so fast it barely feels like a choice. It feels automatic, almost biological, as if some part of them has learned that safety depends on noticing what other people miss. So while everyone else is simply having an interaction, the empath is doing far more than that. They are listening, interpreting, adjusting, softening, filtering, anticipating. They are deciding what not to say, how to say it, when to stop, when to soothe, when to stay quiet, when to lighten the mood, when to take responsibility for tension they did not create. They are not just present in the conversation. They are managing the emotional field around it. And this is where the exhaustion begins to accelerate. Because the empath often does not only feel their own reactions. They feel the room. They feel the pressure in another person. They feel when something is off before there is evidence. They feel when someone wants attention, control, reassurance, or emotional supply. And the more toxic the person is, the more chaotic the emotional environment becomes. Nothing stays simple. Every interaction contains hidden demands, unspoken tests, or subtle power shifts that require energy to detect. Over time, the empath's nervous system begins to live in a state of constant low-level alertness around these people. Not always panic. Not always fear. Just continuous monitoring. Continuous adaptation. Continuous inner movement. That is why empaths reach their limit faster. Not because they care more in some sentimental way, but because they are processing more, tracking more, and carrying more with every exchange. And then the guilt appears. Because after all that invisible effort, the empath often feels bad for being tired. Bad for needing space. Bad for wanting distance from someone they can tell is wounded, unstable, or emotionally hungry. So instead of stepping back, they stay engaged a little longer. They override the first warning signs. They call it patience. They call it compassion. They call it understanding. But what they are really doing is absorbing far more than the interaction seems to contain. What makes this even harder to see is that empaths rarely think of themselves as people who are doing too much during these interactions. From the inside, it does not feel like effort. It feels like awareness. It feels like care. It feels like trying to keep the connection honest, stable, and emotionally safe. But this is exactly where the hidden mechanism begins. A toxic person often brings more than behavior into a relationship. They bring unresolved tension, unprocessed emotion, buried resentment, unstable self-worth, contradictory signals, and a constant need to discharge inner chaos somewhere. Not always consciously, not always maliciously, but consistently. And the empath, because they are highly responsive to emotional undercurrents, begins to register all of it. This is why the exhaustion is deeper than ordinary social fatigue. The empath is not just reacting to what the toxic person says. They are reacting to what that person cannot regulate, cannot name, and cannot hold within themselves. They feel the agitation beneath the smile, the accusation hidden inside the question, the neediness disguised as vulnerability, the control wrapped in confusion, the guilt hidden inside silence. And because they can feel that something is happening beneath the surface, they begin trying to organize it internally. That is the first major turning point. The empath becomes an unconscious processor for another person's emotional disorder. Carl Jung wrote about the parts of the psyche that remain unconscious and therefore get projected outward. What a person does not face in themselves, they often press into the atmosphere around them. They make others feel it. They create confusion, tension, self-doubt, emotional pressure, and strange forms of psychic heaviness without ever naming the source. And empaths are often the first to pick up that projection because they are open enough to sense it and responsible enough to try to make sense of it. So the empath does something that looks compassionate on the outside, but is costly on the inside. They begin translating chaos. They try to read what the other person meant. They excuse contradictions. They search for the wound beneath the manipulation. They notice the pain behind the aggression. They keep asking themselves what happened to make this person this way. And while that may sound emotionally mature, it creates a dangerous shift. The empath stops relating to the person in front of them and starts relating to the pain inside that person as if it now belongs to them to hold. That is why toxic people drain empaths faster than they drain others. Many people feel discomfort and pull away. The empath feels discomfort and leans in to decode it. They do not just hear a sharp tone and think, "That was rude." They think, "Something is wrong." They do not just feel distance and accept it. They start scanning for what changed. They do not just notice emotional instability. They begin adapting to it, predicting it, making room for it. And in doing so, they slowly become the container for emotions that were never theirs to metabolize. This is also why the empath often leaves these interactions confused instead of simply angry. Anger would create clarity. Confusion keeps them engaged. Confusion makes them return to the moment, replay the details, reinterpret the signals, and keep psychologically working long after the interaction is over. So if you have ever walked away from someone not just tired, but mentally crowded, emotionally foggy, and strangely burdened by feelings you could not explain, comment below. Have you ever felt drained by a person who never fully said what they were doing, but somehow made you carry it anyway? The most uncomfortable truth is this: toxic people do not drain empaths faster simply because they are more demanding. They drain them faster because empaths stay emotionally available long after other people would have closed the door. That availability is rarely naive. In fact, it often comes from something that looks like strength. The empath can hold complexity. They can see pain where others only see bad behavior. They can detect fear behind control, emptiness behind arrogance, insecurity behind criticism, and abandonment terror beneath emotional volatility. But this gift becomes dangerous when insight replaces self-protection. Because once the empath sees the wound, they stop responding only to what the person is doing. They start responding to what the person must have suffered. And that changes everything. Now the toxic behavior is no longer just exhausting. It becomes explainable. And once it becomes explainable, it becomes tolerable. The sharp tone gets reinterpreted. The manipulation gets softened by context. The inconsistency gets forgiven because the empath senses pain underneath it. The emotional chaos is no longer experienced as a warning. It is experienced as something tragic, something that should be handled carefully, something that must not be judged too quickly. This is where exhaustion deepens into entanglement. Because toxic people often live in contradiction. They can wound you and make you feel guilty for noticing. They can withdraw and make you chase clarity. They can create instability and then act hurt when you respond to it. They can draw emotional labor out of you without ever directly asking for it. And the empath, because they are responsive to what is unspoken, ends up filling in all the missing emotional space. They explain what was not explained. They calm what was not regulated. They carry what was not admitted. They hold tension that the other person keeps exporting into the relationship. And this happens for longer than most people realize because the empath's threshold is unusually high. They can endure discomfort that would make others leave much sooner. They can sit inside ambiguity, mixed signals, emotional turbulence, and unresolved tension without immediately breaking contact. Not because it feels good. Not because it is healthy. But because they have trained themselves to remain connected even when connection starts costing them pieces of themselves. That is why they reach the limit faster in the long run. Their collapse does not come from a lack of capacity. It comes from overcapacity used in the wrong environment. The empath understands too much, absorbs too much, forgives too much, and waits too long for coherence to emerge. They keep thinking that if they stay calm enough, loving enough, patient enough, insightful enough, something in the dynamic will settle. But toxic dynamics rarely settle through understanding alone. Very often, understanding just makes the empath easier to keep inside the system. And guilt locks the whole mechanism in place. Because the moment the empath starts feeling drained, another voice appears. Maybe I am being unfair. Maybe they are struggling. Maybe they do not mean it the way it feels. Maybe I should be more patient. Maybe pulling back would make me cold, selfish, or unkind. So instead of honoring the first signs of depletion, they override them. They stay in the conversation. They offer one more explanation. They give one more chance. They reopen after they should have closed. They keep trying to create emotional clarity with someone whose chaos depends on preventing it. And all the while, their nervous system is paying the bill. This is what many empaths do not see until they are already near burnout. The deepest drain often happens before the obvious damage. It happens in the constant anticipation, the emotional bracing, the subtle self-editing, the effort to remain fair while being internally flooded. By the time the empath says, "I can't do this anymore," they have usually been carrying the weight of that dynamic for far longer than anyone around them ever understood. So the real reason toxic people exhaust empaths faster is not just that they take more. It is that empaths remain open longer, process deeper, and mistake prolonged endurance for love. The price of this pattern does not show up all at once. It leaks into everyday life in ways that are easy to misread. At first, the empath just thinks they are tired. They need more sleep, more quiet, a little distance. But the exhaustion does not fully lift, because it is not simple fatigue. It is the aftermath of carrying too much emotional data for too long. It is what happens when the mind has been interpreting mixed signals, the body has been bracing against tension, and the heart has been trying to stay open in an environment that keeps punishing openness. That kind of exhaustion changes a person. It becomes harder to think clearly after certain interactions. The empath leaves a conversation and cannot settle. They replay small details. A pause. A look. A sentence that felt harmless on the surface but landed with strange weight. Part of them keeps trying to solve what happened, not realizing that this mental replay is itself part of the drain. Their energy is not only being taken during the interaction. It is being taken long after, through rumination, self-questioning, and emotional residue. Then the damage moves deeper. What once felt like intuition starts to feel like instability. The empath no longer knows whether they are accurately sensing something or just becoming too affected. They begin doubting their own perception. They feel tension in someone else, then tell themselves they are imagining it. They feel hurt, then minimize it because the other person is going through a lot. They feel the need to pull back, then shame themselves for becoming distant. Little by little, their inner signals stop feeling trustworthy because they have spent too long overriding them. This is one of the most painful consequences of toxic exhaustion. It weakens self-trust. And when self-trust weakens, identity begins to blur. The empath becomes less spontaneous, less relaxed, less clear about what they actually feel. They start entering interactions already half-edited, already prepared to manage reactions, already aware of how easily the emotional weather can shift. What used to be natural now feels calculated. What used to be generous now feels compulsory. Even silence is no longer restful, because silence becomes another space where tension has to be interpreted. This is why toxic dynamics do not only drain energy, they shrink presence. The empath may still look functional from the outside. They may still show up, still listen, still care, still perform responsibility and warmth. But inwardly, something is thinning out. Their joy becomes less available. Their focus weakens. Their body stays tense longer. Their emotional range narrows. They are no longer just loving people deeply. They are surviving people internally. And perhaps the cruelest part is that many empaths mistake this erosion for personal failure. They call themselves too sensitive, too complicated, too fragile, too emotional. They think the problem is that they cannot handle difficult people the way others seem to. But what they are actually experiencing is the real cost of prolonged overexposure to emotional chaos. Not weakness, not immaturity, not overreaction. Just a human system that has been absorbing more than it was ever meant to hold. The turning point begins the moment the empath stops asking, "Why does this person affect me so much?" and starts asking, "What role have I been unconsciously playing inside this emotional system?" That question changes everything, because it breaks the spell of passive confusion. Up until that moment, the empath usually sees the exhaustion as something that is merely happening to them. This person is draining. This relationship is heavy. This dynamic is painful. And all of that is true. But a deeper layer comes into view when they realize that their suffering is not only coming from the other person's instability. It is also coming from the invisible job they took on in response to it. They became the reader of moods, the absorber of tension, the translator of contradictions, the one who noticed what was wrong before it was spoken, the one who stayed emotionally present when the atmosphere became distorted, the one who kept trying to metabolize what the other person kept discharging. And that is where a more sobering form of lucidity appears. The empath begins to see that their gift was never just sensitivity. It was participation. Not conscious participation. Not chosen in any simple way. But real participation nonetheless. Their nervous system had been recruited into a pattern of constant vigilance, subtle self-abandonment, and emotional overfunctioning. They were not just witnessing chaos. They were adapting to it so completely that adaptation started to feel like personality. This is why the awakening can feel both powerful and painful. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you can no longer call it love when your entire inner world has to contort itself to remain connected. You can no longer call it compassion when your empathy requires chronic self-betrayal. You can no longer call it patience when your body has been in a prolonged state of emotional surveillance. At that point, something begins to separate inside the empath. Not from care, but from fusion. They start realizing that compassion and absorption are not the same thing. Understanding someone is not the same thing as carrying them internally. Sensing another person's pain does not make you responsible for organizing it, softening it, or staying available to it without limit. And perhaps most importantly, being able to read emotional chaos does not mean you are meant to live inside it. That realization is not dramatic on the outside. It is not always loud. Often it is quiet and almost surgical. The empath notices how quickly their body tightens around certain people. They notice how often they edit themselves before speaking. They notice how much of their energy goes into predicting reactions. They notice that what they once called closeness often felt more like management. They notice that after certain interactions, they do not feel nourished, challenged, or even truly seen. They feel consumed. And with that, the old question starts losing power. The question is no longer, how do I keep this bond stable? It becomes, how much of my life force is being spent maintaining an emotional environment that keeps feeding on my awareness? That is the beginning of real repositioning. Not a performance of strength. Not a sudden transformation into someone cold. Not a fantasy of never caring again. But a deeper, cleaner recognition. My exhaustion has meaning. It has structure. It is telling the truth about what my mind kept justifying and what my heart kept trying to redeem. This is what Jung understood in a deeper psychological sense. What remains unconscious governs us until it becomes visible. And for the empath, one of the most dangerous unconscious patterns is confusing receptivity with obligation. Confusing emotional attunement with emotional duty. Confusing the ability to feel with the assignment to carry. Once that confusion begins to break, the empath does not instantly become healed. But they do become harder to consume. Because now they can see the mechanism while it is happening. They can feel the pull without immediately surrendering to it. They can recognize that not every pain they detect is theirs to enter. And that is where the exhaustion stops feeling like a personal flaw and starts revealing itself as evidence of how deeply they had been giving themselves away. So when an empath reaches the point of emotional exhaustion, the real story is almost never the one people see from the outside. It is not that they were too fragile for reality. Not that they cared too much in some naive, sentimental way. Not that they failed to handle one difficult person. It is that they spent too long living with their inner world open in places where openness was being used against them. They kept reading what others ignored. They kept feeling what others avoided. They kept making room for tension, contradiction, instability, and emotional spillover that was never truly theirs. And because they could endure it longer than most people, everyone assumed they were fine long after they had already started disappearing inside the strain. That is the hidden tragedy of the empath's exhaustion. It comes from strengths that were turned into access points. Sensitivity became overexposure. Understanding became tolerance. Patience became prolonged self-abandonment. Empathy became a doorway through which other people's chaos kept entering. But once you see that clearly, something changes. You stop calling your depletion weakness. You stop treating your overwhelm like a character flaw. You stop assuming that because you can sense pain, you are required to house it. And maybe that is the deepest shift of all, realizing that your exhaustion was never proof that you were too much. It was proof that you had been carrying too much, for too long, without naming what it was costing you. The empath is not the person who breaks because they are weak. The empath is often the person who breaks only after staying strong in the wrong environment, far beyond what anyone else would survive internally. And when that truth finally becomes conscious, exhaustion stops being just a wound. It becomes evidence. Evidence of where you have been overextended. Evidence of what has been feeding on your awareness. Evidence that your sensitivity was never the problem. Your unguarded availability was. If this spoke to something you have lived, subscribe and stay with this channel. This is where people who have spent years carrying what was never theirs begin to finally see it clearly.